Hello, my name is Pavel Kořínek. I'm a Czech comic scholar, and today I would like to talk about the necessity of global and transnational comic history. I would like to argue that it's really important and it's really long overdue to get that overreaching global volume that will try to follow all these trails of various comic genres, comic characters, comic series around the globe. What we really need is this tome that will try to connect these local comic traditions that are being described in dedicated volumes all around the world to offer a really global look at the comic tradition, at this net of transnational comic history of the 20th century. As an example, I decided to focus on these three canine characters. All these three dogs were quite popular at their time in 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, and all three are nearly forgotten by now. I would like to start with the Czech one, with Punta. I first encountered Punta about 10 years ago. I was at the time researching a history of Czechoslovak comics of the 20th century together with my colleagues, and I was focusing on the interwar period Czechoslovakian comics aimed at young children. This was arguably the most influential comic magazine of that era. It started in 1935 and it was published until 1942 when it was banned by Nazi protectorate authorities. Over the span of that 8 years, about 550 pages of caption series focusing on the anthropomorphized dog were prepared, and about 140 issues of its titular magazine were published by the publishing house. Punta was probably the most popular comic magazine of that time, and it was one of the most famous comic characters of Czechoslovakian comics in the 1930s and 1940s. Therefore, when we finished our work on the history of Czechoslovak comics, I decided to focus solely on this comic series and to try to offer a more detailed interpretation of this magazine, of this series, and all it contains, and all its important and interesting details. Together with my co-author, fellow scholar, and my wife Lucie, we decided to take a look at Punta from various angles. We wanted to offer as many as possible interpretations of this comic series from the 1930s and 1940s. And when researching these comics, we were also obviously focusing on how it started, on its origin. What we knew already was that Punta was not, in fact, really genuine Czech comic character. It started as a translation of sorts, as a translation of also a nearly forgotten comic strip, Dolly, Dimples, and Bobby Bounce by American artist Grace Gebbie Drayton. This comic strip was syndicalized in American newspapers in 1920s and the beginning of 1930s, and it told adventures of titular Dolly Dimples character, her friend Bobby, and their dog Comfy. And it was these adventures of Dolly, Bobby, and Comfy which were at first directly translated to Czech. We do not know how these strips came to Czechoslovakia. The strip was already discontinued in the United States in 1934 when the translated versions of these strips started to be published in Czech magazines, in kids' periodicals and kids' supplementum of general magazines. We do not know how it happened. We do not know whether there was some contract with the agency. We do not know whether these comics were acquired via some syndicate. What we know, on the other hand, is that the signatures of Grace Gebbie Drayton were retouched out of all the panels. So there may have been some shady, not so legal aspect. When you take a look at the American original panel by Grace Gebbie Drayton and its Czech version, you see some discrepancies, you see some differences. At first, take a look at the handwritten boom that was adapted to typewritten boom with exclamation mark in Czech. And there's also quite a difference in the actual caption underneath the panel. While in English it reads, and instantly there was a loud boom, the Czech version is much more detailed, much more literal. And once she finished her talk, it started, oh horror, the hellish chaos. It's really different text. Obviously, it was possible that the Czech adaptator, Czech translator, decided not to follow the original text and to offer more creative retelling based on the pictures. But still, there were too many discrepancies be for us to be such happy to just overcome them with thinking, okay, that was just some adaptation error or mistake. After some research, we found out that Dolly Dimples and her dog Comfy came to Czechoslovakia and became Punta not directly, but via third country, via the interlocutor, interstage. In German newspaper Thüringer Allgemeine Zeitung, we located in 1933 exactly the same episodes that were translated to Czech. And not just that, these episodes in German were in fact adapted in a similar way. The German texting underneath the panel is much closer to Czech texting. And as you can see by the typography, the boom by typewritten boom was introduced in this German version, in fact. So here we are. American comic strip came to Czechoslovakia to become new stories via Germany. After 10 or 15 episodes, what happened with Dolly Dimples in Czech context was that Czech editors decided that it will be easier, probably more cost effective for them, not to try to adapt more original American stories, but they hired Czech artist René Klapač and several writers to prepare new original stories about Punta. Punta, in English Spotty, is the name of the dog character. And while in Dolly Dimples, Comfy is more like a sidekick, in Punta, the dog character takes central stage. When we found out that Dolly Dimples was in fact introduced to Czechoslovakia via Germany, we decided that we should take a closer look at that German version. What we found out is that in Germany, Comfy, Dolly, and Bobby somehow had a similar lives drawn for them as in Czechoslovakia. Originally, in Thüringer Allgemeine Zeitung, direct translations of the original strips were published. Obviously, characters were renamed. Dolly became Honey, Bobby became Fritz, and Comfy became Putzi. But over few episodes, over few months and following episodes, the strips started to leave the original behind. There were similar movement in German newspaper happening as it was in Czech context. In Thüringer Allgemeine Zeitung, new original adventures of these characters started to be published. Honey, Putzi, and Fritz became new characters based on the American originals, but done by German writer Joachim Rode and German artist Fritz Lapke. They even introduced a new character, this Raven Kolk, and together these four started to star in their own new comic strip and illustrated books, as you can see on these images. So basically what happened is that one original American comic strip, discontinued at the time, just to remind you, gave birth to several, or two at least, comic series over the ocean. In Germany, Comfy became Putzi and started to have his new adventures in the Alpine and German landscape, while in Czechoslovakia, he became Punta and gave birth to this hugely influential kids comics and kids magazine of interwar Czechoslovakia. When we take a look at these three canine characters together, we can see some similarities. We can see that they all adapt and evolve from the same canine character, who can be Fido by Grace Gebbie from the beginning of 20th century. One American dog went over the ocean, and behind the ocean, he probably, arguably, had a more famous career than in the original American strip. Punta, to follow him back for a while, never wanted to hide his love of American popular culture. On the pages of Punta magazine, several American celebrities took place. Punta became friends with Laurel and Hardy, quite popular comics of the time. Laurel and Hardy even actually acted in the panels of Punta comics. Here you can see a scene from one of the Laurel and Hardy movies, March of the Wooden Soldiers, being redone, adapted as a part of the Punta series, Punta narrative. Punta is actually in the cinema watching this scene redone from the original film still to comic panel. Punta was in fact a Czech attempt to offer something like Disney comic magazine. In 1940, it even started to publish Czech version of the Snow White and Seven Dwarfs. And here on the cover of the 76th issue of Punta magazine, you can see Punta inviting Snow White and her dwarf friends on its pages. And here you see on the illustration from Punta's fairy tales that these connections and these adaptations were really quite literal at the time. For Punta, to follow American pop culture was somehow to go back to its origin, to go back to its roots. Here you see that Punta even had an extramarital affair with Greta Garbo, while Kiki is watching it quite angry from behind the curtain. This image somehow encapsulates the story of Punta, the story of Comfy and story of Putzi. The American dog, based and really encapsulated in the American popular culture, went abroad. And in German, in Czech context, it gave birth to really new comic series, which became more popular, more influential for local comic scenes than the American origin. While in American context, Grace Gebbie's Dolly, Dimples, and Bobby Bounce is not one of these most important comic strips of the 1920s, 1930s. There are dozens of more important, more influential series. Through these adaptations, through these connections, it became really influential starting point for evolution of German and Czech comic scenes. When we follow traits like this, when we follow stories like this, it tells us a lot about how this establishment of this global republic of comics, global comic scene of the 21st century started. These stories may be accidental, this story may be anecdotal, but together they tell us something important about how global comics came into being. I believe that if we follow these stories more closely, if we decide to focus on them, it would tell us something important, something crucial about comics and its never-ending popularity and its overreaching popularity all around the world. Thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of this brilliant festival.